The day Theodora Norris stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, the summer of 1878, she had exactly $1 in her coat pocket, a letter folded so many times it had grown soft as cloth along the creases, and the kind of quietly desperate determination that only grief and necessity together can manufacture in a woman. The dust rose up around her boots the moment her feet touched the packed dirt of the main road, and she stood there for a moment with her single traveling trunk being tossed down from the roof of the coach behind her, surveying the town that was supposed to represent her salvation. Caldwell was a cattle town, loud and purposeful, built right along the Kisham Trail where Texas longhorns had been driven north for years, and the summer heat sat over it like a lid pressed down on a boiling pot. Men moved along the boardwalks with the efficient stride of people who had things to do and weather to beat. A blacksmith hammered somewhere unseen. A woman hung laundry from a line strung between two buildings. Horses stood at hitching posts with their tails switching at flies. Theodora was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and more capable than anyone who looked at her slender frame and her traveling clothes would have immediately guessed. She had come from Ohio, from a life that had collapsed around her with the speed and thoroughness of a building hit by fire, and she had traveled by rail and then by stage to arrive here because of a letter written by her late father, Jefferson Norris, to a man named Harold Beckett. Her father had been a merchant, a careful man who had built a small fortune from dry goods and hardware over the course of 20 years in Columbus, Ohio. When he had died of a fever the previous winter, Theodora had discovered with quiet devastation that the careful man had also been a trusting one, and that a series of creditors and one particularly unscrupulous business partner had stripped away most of what he had built. What remained after the settlement of his debts was the traveling trunk, the silver dollar, and several letters addressed to men in the Western territories who had done business with Jefferson Norris over the years and owed him favors, and therefore owed his daughter the consideration of a new beginning. The letter to Harold Beckett was the most promising of the lot. Jefferson Norris had written in his careful slanted hand that Harold owed him for a shipment of lumber he had fronted the money for in 1874, that the debt had never been formally repaid, and that if his daughter Theodora should ever present herself in Caldwell, Harold ought to see her right as a matter of honor between men. The letter promised she was hardworking, educated, and capable of taking on honest employment, and it closed with the kind of firm but dignified language that her father had always preferred, the language of a man who had believed in the basic decency of other men and had, to the very end, not entirely lost faith in it. Theodora had written to Harold Beckett before departing Ohio to tell him she was coming. She had received no reply, but she had told herself that replies were uncertain things in a territory where the mail moved slowly and men were occupied, and she had packed her trunk and traveled west on the hope that when she arrived, Harold Beckett would remember his obligation to Jefferson Norris and would help her find her footing. She lifted her trunk herself because there was no one to do it for her, and carried it up the main street to the general store, which a man at the stage depot had confirmed belonged to Harold Beckett. The store was a fine enough establishment for Caldwell, 2 stories of fresh lumber with the name Beckett's Supply painted in steady black letters above the door. Theodora set her trunk against the outside wall, straightened her hat, smoothed the front of her coat, and walked inside. Harold Beckett was behind the counter when she entered, a heavy-set man somewhere in his late 50s with a broad red face and the look of a man who had done well and knew it. He was talking to another man, a rancher by the look of his clothes and the calluses visible on his thick hands, and he did not immediately look up when the bell above the door announced Theodora's entrance. She waited. The 2 men finished their conversation about the price of cattle feed. Then Harold Beckett looked at her the way men in stores look at women who are clearly there to buy something, with professional pleasantness and mild impatience. "Help you, miss?" "Mr. Beckett," Theodora said. "My name is Theodora Norris. I wrote to you from Columbus, Ohio in the spring. I am Jefferson Norris's daughter." Something moved across Harold Beckett's broad red face at the name. It was not warmth. It was more like the specific expression of a man who has been hoping a particular problem would not materialize and has now been proven wrong in that hope. "Norris," he repeated. "Yes, sir." She reached into her coat and drew out the letter, unfolding it carefully along its worn creases and placing it on the counter between them. "My father wrote this before he died. He believed you were a man who honored your word." Harold Beckett looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. He read enough of it from where it lay that his expression shifted again, this time toward something that Theodora could only describe as calculated discomfort. "Miss Norris," he said finally, "I'm sorry about your father. Jefferson Norris was a decent man, but I have to be honest with you. That lumber arrangement was a long time ago, and the circumstances of it were not exactly as your father may have remembered them. There were losses on my end I never recovered from. The debt your father felt I owed him, well, I don't see it the same way." Theodora looked at him steadily. "Mr. Beckett, I have not come to ask you for charity. I have come to ask for what my father was owed. A position in your store, a fair wage, a reference to honest employment in this town. That is all." "I appreciate that," Harold Beckett said, in the tone of a man who appreciated nothing of the kind, "but I'm fully staffed. My wife's nephew came in from Missouri last month. I don't have a position to offer." The rancher who had been in conversation with Beckett had not left. He was standing slightly to one side with the unhurried patience of a man waiting to see how a situation resolved itself. Theodora was aware of him the way she was aware of the heat and the dust, as part of the landscape of a difficult day. "Then a reference," she said. "You know this town. You could speak to someone on my behalf." "I don't know that I'm the right person to be arranging employment for strangers, miss. I mean no offense by that." "I am not a stranger," Theodora said, and her voice was even, but something behind her eyes had gone very still and very bright. "I am the daughter of a man you owed a debt to, and I have traveled 900 miles because he believed you were someone who honored his obligations. If you will not help me, please tell me plainly so that I know where I stand." Harold Beckett straightened up to his full height behind the counter and said, "I'm sorry for your situation, Miss Norris. I truly am. But I can't be held accountable for every arrangement your father thought he had with folks across the country. Good day to you." He picked up the letter from the counter and held it out to her, and there was a finality in the gesture that was worse than the words, because it meant he had looked at her father's careful handwriting, at the last thing Jefferson Norris had ever done to try to provide for his daughter, and he had decided it was worth nothing. Theodora took the letter back. She folded it along its soft creases and put it in her coat pocket. She said, "Good day, Mr. Beckett," and she said it with a composure that cost her more than she would ever have admitted, and she walked back out into the bright summer heat of Caldwell, Kansas, where her trunk was sitting against the wall, and the dust was blowing gently down the street, and she had $1 and no prospects. She sat down on the edge of the boardwalk beside her trunk, because there was nothing else to do for a moment, and she let herself have 30 seconds of quiet despair before she put it away. 30 seconds was as much as she could afford. She counted them out in her head, and then she straightened her back and looked up at the street and began to think. She was considering the question of the hotel, specifically of whether the $1 would cover a night's room, and whether that was the wisest use of it, when she became aware that the rancher from inside the store had come out and was standing a few feet away from her, looking at nothing in particular in the middle distance, the way men in the West sometimes did when they were thinking about whether to say something. She looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not been shaved in several days, and the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but was deeply, thoroughly interesting, all strong lines and weathered coloring, and a set of gray eyes that were currently aimed somewhere down the street, with an expression that was somewhere between thoughtful and irritated. He was wearing a working rancher's clothes, worn canvas trousers, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and boots that had seen considerable use, and his hat was pushed back on his head at a slight angle that seemed less affectation than the result of a man who kept pushing his hat back when he thought. "He owed your father money," the man said, not looking at her, still addressing the middle distance. "That was the understanding," Theodora said. "Beckett's got money enough. He's just the kind of man who decides what he owes based on what he thinks he can get away with not paying." I had begun to form that impression. The man finally looked at her. There was something direct and unadorned in the way he did it. No performance, no particular attempt at charm, just the look of a person who, having decided to engage with a situation, engaged with it fully. "Cornelius Malone," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and respectful. "Theodora Norris." "Where are you staying, Miss Norris?" "I haven't yet determined that." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already worked out. "You need a position, that's what you told Beckett." "I need employment, yes. I can keep accounts, manage a store's inventory, sew, cook, teach if there's a school that needs a teacher. I'm not particular about which." Cornelius Malone looked at her for another moment in that direct, unhurried way. Then he said, "I've got a ranch 12 miles outside of town. My housekeeper left in March to go live with her daughter in Wichita. I've been managing the house myself on top of everything else, which is not a sustainable arrangement. I need someone who can run the domestic side of things and keep the books for the ranch operation. It's honest work. There's a separate room in the house, and I pay a fair wage." Theodora looked at him carefully. In 1878, in a cattle town in Kansas, a woman accepting a position at a lone male rancher's property was not a socially simple thing. She understood this. She was also sitting on a boardwalk with a silver dollar and a letter no one would honor, and she had come 900 miles, and she was not going to collapse now over the question of appearances. "What is the wage?" she asked. He told her. It was fair, as he had said, more than fair actually, closer to what a man might have expected for similar work. "I would need my own room with a door that locks," she said. "It locks," he said. "I'll get you a key cut at the hardware store this afternoon. I would need Sundays free for church if there is one, and for letter writing. Sundays are yours." "Then I accept, Mr. Malone. I accept with gratitude." Something shifted in his expression at the word gratitude, a slight tightening, as though the word bothered him on her behalf. "You don't need to be grateful," he said. "I need the help. It's a working arrangement." "Nevertheless," she said. He looked at the trunk beside her on the boardwalk. "Is that everything?" "That's everything." Without further discussion, he picked up the trunk as though it weighed nothing, which to him it probably did, and carried it toward his horse and wagon, which was tied at the far end of the street, and Theodora Norris followed him into the new chapter of her life. The Malone Ranch was 12 miles from Caldwell, as he had said, situated on a wide stretch of grassland that rolled gently under the enormous Kansas sky. And when they came over a low rise in the road and she saw it for the first time, Theodora felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was clenched there. It was not a grand property, but it was solid and well-maintained. A 2-story frame house painted white with green shutters, a large barn, several outbuildings and corrals where a small herd of horses moved in the afternoon light. There were cottonwood trees along what she could see was a creek to the west of the house, and their leaves turned silver in the hot breeze. "It's beautiful," she said, without intending to say it aloud. Cornelius Malone glanced at her from the wagon seat beside her. He was driving with the loose, easy competence of a man who had made this drive thousands of times, the reins held lightly in his large hands. "It does all right," he said. There were 3 ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse some distance from the main house, men named Porter, Silas, and a young man who went by the name of Red on account of his hair. They were respectful but curious when Cornelius introduced Theodora as the new housekeeper, and she could see them recalibrating their understanding of the household and what her presence in it meant. She looked each of them in the eye when she was introduced and spoke to them clearly and without either defensiveness or excessive friendliness, and she could see that she had, if not won them over, at least established herself as someone who was not going to be managed. Cornelius showed her the house. It was clean enough for a man managing alone, which meant it was not quite as clean as she would have liked, but it was not a disaster either. The kitchen was large and well equipped. There was a sitting room with a stone fireplace, a dining room, and a small room off the kitchen that had been the housekeeper's, which had its own window looking out over the cottonwood trees and a solid door with a brass lock. He left her to settle in while he went to see to the evening's ranch work, which told her that he was either genuinely respectful of her privacy or simply occupied, and she suspected both were true. She unpacked her trunk with care. She had brought practical things, work dresses, her father's accounting ledgers from which she had learned the craft of keeping books, a small Bible, and at the bottom, wrapped in a clean piece of linen, a portrait daguerreotype of her parents taken on their wedding day in 1851. The year Ohio was still new enough that Columbus felt like the edge of the world to young people starting out. She set the daguerreotype on the windowsill and looked at it for a moment. Her father's careful face looked back at her out of time, and she thought about the letter in her coat pocket, and about Harold Beckett's dismissal, and about the man who had walked out of that store and picked up her trunk and driven her 12 miles out into the Kansas grassland simply because there was work that needed doing and she had needed it. She thought she would probably be all right. The first weeks at the Malone ranch established the rhythms that would govern the next months. Theodora rose before dawn, started the kitchen stove, and had breakfast ready when Cornelius and the hands came in from the morning chores. She learned quickly what the house needed and set about providing it with the same methodical efficiency she had watched her father apply to his merchant operation in Columbus. She scrubbed the kitchen floor and the dining room boards and the windows. She planted a kitchen garden in the space behind the house where the soil was good, because it was the right time of year to get a late summer planting in. She went through the ranch's financial records, which Cornelius had been keeping in a haphazard way that reflected the demands of a man who was better with cattle than with columns of numbers, and she organized them with the quiet satisfaction of someone putting a disordered room to rights. Cornelius watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read. He was not a demonstrative man. He said little that was not practical, and in those first weeks their conversations were mostly the efficient exchanges of two people managing a shared operation, what needed buying in town, what the records showed about the feed costs, whether the garden soil wanted lime. But there was something in the way he spoke to her that she noticed and appreciated. Something even and unhurried and entirely without condescension, as though it simply did not occur to him to treat her differently for being a woman, which in 1878 Kansas was not as unremarkable as it should have been. One evening about 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she was in the sitting room after supper working through the accounting ledgers by lamplight, and Cornelius came in from the barn later than usual, having dealt with a heifer that was struggling to deliver a calf, and he sat down in the armchair across from her and stretched out his long legs and looked at the fire for a while in comfortable silence. "Did the heifer come through all right?" Theodora asked without looking up from the ledger. "She did. Calf too." "Scrappy little thing," he paused. "You've been at those books every evening this week." "The records from the last 2 years had some inconsistencies I want to understand before I can present you a clear picture of the operation. Find anything alarming?" "Nothing alarming. Some patterns worth discussing. You've been paying more for feed than you need to if you purchase in larger quantities from the supplier in Wichita rather than the one in Caldwell." He looked at her with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You've been looking at my feed costs. You're paying 14% more per hundredweight than you need to. Over a year, that adds up." This time the smile was definite, brief, and genuine, and it changed his whole face in a way that surprised her and then, in the quiet of the evening, went on surprising her even after it was gone. "What else? You have 3 promissory notes outstanding that appear to have been forgotten. Two of them are probably not worth pursuing. One of them, from a man named Hargrove, is for a significant enough sum that it might be worth having a conversation with your lawyer. Hargrove moved to Denver. Then a letter. Cornelius looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes. "Miss Norris," he said, "I think you may be the most useful person who has ever set foot on this ranch." It was a practical compliment, and she knew it was meant as one, and yet something about it settled warmly somewhere in the middle of her chest. "I'm glad to be useful," she said. The summer deepened and then began very slowly to relent, the heat stepping back degree by degree toward the cooler promise of fall. Theodora's kitchen garden produced abundantly, and she learned to put up preserves in the mason jars she bought in Caldwell on the ranch's weekly supply runs, and the shelves in the kitchen began to glow with the jewel colors of bottled tomatoes and peaches and green beans. She and Cornelius began to talk more. Not just about the ranch operations, though they talked about those too, but about the things that come up between two intelligent people who find themselves sharing meals and evenings with some regularity. He told her about the ranch, which he had started 7 years earlier when he was 25, coming to Kansas from Missouri with money he had saved from 3 years of cattle drives, and a determination to build something of his own rather than make other men wealthy for the rest of his working life. He had built the house himself, with the help of a neighbor, a man named Frank Davies, who had since moved his family to Colorado. He had bought his first cattle and horses, and had weathered 2 bad winters and a dry summer, and a bout of fever that had kept him bedridden for 3 weeks with no one to look after him. She told him about Ohio, about her father's store, and the way she had spent her childhood helping her father with the accounts, sitting on a high stool at the merchant's counter, and learning the precise, satisfying language of numbers. She told him about her mother, who had died when Theodora was 12 of a lung complaint, and about the years after that when it had been just the two of them, father and daughter, managing the household together. She told him about the collapse of the business after her father's death, about the creditors, about the other letters she had brought west and the way they had all, in one way or another, come to nothing. Beckett was the last one, he asked. The most promising one, she said. There were 2 others. One man had died. The other had sold his property and moved, and no one knew where. Cornelius was quiet for a moment. They were sitting on the porch in the long summer evening, the heat finally bearable as the sun moved lower, and the grassland around the ranch glowed gold in the angled light. "Your father wrote those letters to give you options," he said. "He did. He sounds like a good man." "He was," Theodora said. "He was not a perfect man, but he was a very good one. He trusted people too readily, but I think that is a better fault than the alternative." Cornelius looked out at the golden grassland for a long moment. "Better than not trusting anyone at all," he agreed, and there was something in his voice when he said it that made her think the observation was not purely philosophical. "Did something happen to make you not trust people?" she asked, because she had learned in those weeks that he responded better to directness than to the careful circling around that she had been trained to use as a young woman in polite Ohio society. He looked at her sideways, the half-smile again. "Not particularly. I just spent enough time driving cattle across the country to learn that people generally do what's good for them, and that you're better off building your life on things you can see and measure than on what people promise. And yet you offered me a position based on a 5-minute conversation outside a general store. I could see you needed it and I needed the help. That's not trust, that's observation. I think you're drawing a finer line than actually exists there, Mr. Malone." He laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that she found she wanted to hear again. "Maybe so." In September, a situation arose that complicated the easy balance they had been finding. A woman named Catherine Price, the wife of a cattle broker in Caldwell, let it be known in the way that women in small western towns communicated social information, through carefully positioned remarks at the dry goods counter and after Sunday services, that she found it irregular that a young, unmarried woman was keeping house at the Malone Ranch without a proper chaperone. Catherine Price was not a malicious woman, exactly, but she was the kind of woman who felt that social order was genuinely important in frontier communities, and who communicated her concerns about the maintenance of that order with the blunt authority of someone who had never needed to sit on a boardwalk and count her coins. Theodora heard about it third hand, from the wife of the Reverend Alderson at the small Methodist church she had been attending on Sundays, a gentle woman named Martha Alderson, who told her with visible embarrassment and visible sympathy simultaneously. "I want you to know that, Reginald, and I have nothing but respect for your situation," Martha Alderson said, taking Theodora's hand in hers outside the church one Sunday morning. "And I think Catherine Price ought to consider what she would do if she found herself in similar circumstances. But I wanted you to know what was being said so you could decide how to address it if you chose to." Theodora thanked Martha Alderson and rode back to the ranch in the wagon with Red, who had driven her into town that morning, and she thought about it carefully all 12 miles home. She told Cornelius that evening. He received the information with a particular stillness that she had come to recognize as his equivalent of what other men might express as anger. He did not look angry. He looked very steady and very contained. "I'll go speak to Mrs. Price," he said. "That will make it worse," Theodora said immediately. "A man going to defend a woman's reputation in these circumstances only makes the situation appear exactly as she is already implying it appears. I've thought about this. The best thing is if I am seen to be doing something ordinary and proper, attending church, being present at the ladies' sewing circle if Mrs. Alderson will include me, managing the ranch's business in Caldwell in a professional manner. It's not fair that you should have to manage it that way." "No," she agreed. "It is not fair, but fair and practical are not always the same thing, and I am very attached to this position, Mr. Malone. It is the first genuinely good thing that has happened to me in a difficult year, and I would prefer not to lose it over Catherine Price's opinion of household arrangements." Cornelius looked at her with an expression that she could not entirely decode. "You're not going to lose the position," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever the town thinks or says, that has nothing to do with whether you have work here." "I understand," she said, "but I would like to manage it as I've described if you don't object." "I don't object to anything you choose to do," he said. "I just want you to know that you don't have to manage it alone." She looked at him for a moment. The lamp between them threw warm light across the planes of his face, and the evening was cooling toward the first real chill of autumn, and the ranch was quiet around them with the deep, satisfying quiet of a place that was being properly cared for. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." The social situation resolved itself more naturally than she had expected, partly through the strategy she had described, and partly through Cornelius, who did not go to speak to Catherine Price, but did make clear to several men in Caldwell, in the particular way that plainspoken men in the West communicate things, that Theodora Norris was a capable and respectable woman doing honest work, and that he would take a dim view of anyone who suggested otherwise. This second piece of the resolution reached her only gradually and indirectly, and when she understood it, she felt a warmth toward him that was already becoming harder to categorize as simply professional appreciation. October came in with blue skies and cold nights and the smell of turning grass, and the ranch settled into the pace of fall work, the preparations for winter, the final tallying of the year's cattle operation, the laying in of supplies. Theodora worked alongside the full rhythms of the ranch now with the ease of someone who had been there for months rather than weeks, and she had developed a comfortable working rapport with Porter and Silas and Red, who had initially treated her with the careful deference of men uncertain of a woman's place in their world, and had gradually shifted to treating her simply as a competent colleague, which was exactly what she wanted. There was an afternoon in early October that she would think about for a long time afterward. She had been in the kitchen putting up the last of the fall preserves when she heard shouting from the direction of the corral, and she came out onto the porch to see that one of the horses, a young gray stallion named Storm that Cornelius had been breaking for the last several weeks, had thrown him. The horse was loose in the corral, dancing and wild-eyed, and Cornelius was getting up from the dirt with the careful movements of a man assessing what he had broken. She was across the yard and through the corral gate before she had consciously decided to move, and she reached him as he straightened up and discovered that he had not broken anything but had hit his head on the fence rail on the way down and had a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely in the way cuts on the head do. "Sit down," she said, and she said it in the tone she had discovered worked best with him, not commanding, simply certain. He sat down on the lower fence rail and looked at her with blood running down the side of his face and asked, "Is Storm all right?" "The horse is perfectly fine," she said, and she was already pulling the clean cloth she kept in her apron pocket. She pressed it firmly against the cut and his hand came up to hold it there, and for a moment their hands overlapped on the cloth and neither of them moved. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes at close range, and the October light was going orange and long across the corral, and there were horses and distance and dust, and the sound of the Kansas wind in the cottonwoods, and Theodora Norris became fully and irreversibly aware, in that moment, that she was in love with Cornelius Malone. It was not a convenient realization. It was not a realization she had been building toward carefully or had welcomed, and it arrived with the kind of sudden absolute clarity that suggests it had been true for some time, and was only now announcing itself loudly enough to be heard. She stepped back and took her hand from under his on the cloth and said, "Keep pressure on it for a while. I'll heat some water and clean it properly." And she walked back to the kitchen with her heart beating at a pace that she felt was entirely disproportionate to the situation. She cleaned and bandaged the cut that evening at the kitchen table, working efficiently and without meeting his eyes any more than necessary. And Cornelius submitted to the process, with the patience of a man who understood that he had done something reckless with the young gray stallion and had earned whatever came of it. When she finished, she cleared away the basin and the cloths and said good night and went to her room, and she lay in her narrow bed under the Kansas stars that pressed in through the window and had a very serious conversation with herself about practical realities. The practical realities were several. She was his employee. She had arrived at his ranch with a silver dollar and a letter no one would honor, which was not a position from which a woman launched romantic aspirations with any dignity. She had been there 4 months, which was long enough to feel at home and not long enough for that to mean anything definitive. He was a good man and a fair employer, and perhaps the kindest thing that had happened to her since her father's death, and she was not going to repay that kindness by complicating his household arrangements with feelings he had not invited. She decided to be sensible, and she was sensible for approximately 2.5 weeks before the evening at the beginning of November when Cornelius came into the sitting room after supper and sat down across from her and said, with the directness that was his primary mode of communication, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the ledger. "I've been trying to work out how to say this in a way that doesn't put you in a difficult position," he said. "And I haven't found a way that entirely avoids it. So I'm going to say it plainly and then tell you clearly that regardless of how you respond, nothing changes between us here on the ranch. Your position is secure, your wages are secure, and my respect for you is not conditional on this conversation going any particular direction." Theodora set down her pen. "I have come to care for you," Cornelius said, "more than as an employer cares for an employee, considerably more. And I am aware that the circumstances, meaning your position here and the fact that you came to the ranch without other options, make it complicated for me to tell you that. I am aware that you might feel some obligation to respond in a particular way that you don't genuinely feel, and I want you to know that there is no such obligation. If you don't feel the same way, I would rather know it plainly and go on as we are, which is already better than most arrangements I've known." There was a long pause. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The wind moved through the cottonwoods outside the window, a sound Theodora had come to love the way you love the reliable things in your life. "In October," she said carefully, "when you fell from storm and I came out to the corral." "Yes," he said, watching her. "Something became clear to me then that I had been trying not to notice for some time, because I had already concluded that the circumstances you have just described made it something I needed to be sensible about." The lamp threw its warm light between them. Cornelius Malone was very still. "I did not want to be a woman who complicated her position out of feelings she hadn't been invited to have," Theodora continued, "and I was trying very hard to be practical. And now," he said, "and now I think perhaps being practical has its limits," she said, "and that you have just told me something quite courageous for a man who doesn't particularly like to need things." Something in his face changed, the way landscapes change when the sun comes out from behind cloud, thoroughly and all at once. "I care for you too," Theodora said, "considerably." They talked for 3 more hours by the fire that night, the way two people talk when they have been carrying on half of a conversation in their own heads for weeks, and are finally allowed to have the whole of it out loud. They talked about what they both wanted, about the ranch and the future of it, about Ohio and Missouri, and the particular loneliness of building a life in a new country without family around you, about what it meant to trust someone and what it required to do it well. They talked about her father and his letters, and the fact that Cornelius had walked out of Harold Beckett's store that afternoon in July not entirely by chance. "You heard the whole conversation," she said. "Most of it," he admitted, "and then you waited to see what I would do. I wanted to see how you handled it, whether you'd crumble or whether you'd hold on." He paused. "You held on impressively." "I didn't feel impressive. I felt quite desperate." "You didn't look desperate. You looked like a woman who knew exactly where she stood and was not going to move from it." She smiled at him. "That's a very charitable interpretation. It's an accurate one." They did not say everything that evening, because some things took more time to be said than an evening allowed. But when Theodora went to her room that night, she set her father's daguerreotype on the windowsill and looked at it for a long time in the dark, and she felt something she had not felt since before Jefferson Norris died, which was that the future was a place she was walking toward rather than a place she was trying to outrun. November brought cold in earnest, the prairie winter settling its considerable weight down on the Kansas landscape, and the ranch drew inward to its winter rhythms, the long evenings indoors, the work of keeping the livestock through the cold, the meals that were heartier and the fires that were larger. There was a quality to those weeks that Theodora would never fully be able to articulate later, only to say that she had not known she was lonely until she was not lonely anymore, and that the understanding of the difference was one of the most significant things that had ever happened to her. Cornelius courted her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was to say quietly, thoroughly, and entirely without pretense. He brought her the first copy of Harper's Weekly she had seen since Ohio, ordered specifically through the Mercantile in Caldwell. He asked her what she thought about things, what she thought about the railroad expansion that was changing the cattle trade, what she thought about the political situation in Washington, what she thought about the poem she had been reading the previous evening when he had come in from the barn and found her with the book in her lap. And he listened to what she said with genuine interest, rather than the polite performance of interest that she had learned to recognize in men, who considered women's opinions a minor accessory to their appearance. He told her things he clearly did not tell many people. About the years he had spent on the cattle drives, about a man he had known and respected who had died badly on the trail one summer in a way that had taken a long time to stop thinking about his family in Missouri, a mother who still lived and a brother he was on poor terms with over a disagreement about their father's estate that had never been properly resolved, about the way he had built the ranch house, room by room, and how he had spent the first year alone in it before the hands came, and how the silence of it had been a thing he had needed and also a thing that had eventually begun to wear. "Did you never think of marrying?" Theodora asked one evening. She was mending by the fire and he was reading, or had been reading and had set the book down, which tended to mean he was thinking about something he might say. "I thought about it," he said. "There was a woman in Caldwell a few years back, a school teacher. We had some understanding between us for a while. What happened? She went back east. Her mother was ill and she went to care for her and didn't come back. I think Kansas was always too far from everything she'd known." He paused. "I don't blame her for it. It's a long way from everywhere this country." "Not so far as Ohio," Theodora said. He looked at her with the quiet smile. "No, not so far as Ohio." She set down her mending. "I want to tell you something," she said. "About coming here." He waited. "When I left Ohio, I was more frightened than I let myself know at the time. I had the letters and I had a plan, but underneath the plan was a very large emptiness that I was trying not to look directly at. My father was gone and everything he had built was gone, and the life I had expected to lead was not available to me anymore. And I was going west because west was the direction that people go when they need to remake themselves, and I did not know if I was capable of it." "You were capable of it," he said. "I am capable of it," she agreed. "But what I am trying to say is that when you picked up my trunk outside Beckett's store, you were not just offering me a job. You were offering me the chance to find out whether I could do it. And I need you to know that I understand that, and that I am not here because I had nowhere else to go. I am here because this is where I want to be." The fire popped and threw light across the room, and Cornelius Malone looked at Theodora Norris for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on him before, something unguarded and open and nakedly tender. And then he said, "I am very glad you're here." December came, and with it the particular quality of winter on the open plains, vast and white and profoundly still, the wind working across the empty miles and the sky pressing low and gray. The ranch was snowed in for 4 days in the middle of the month, and during those 4 days they were largely confined to the house together, with only the animals requiring care to bring them outside. And it was during those 4 days that something final and irreversible settled into place between them. They played cards in the evenings, and Theodora discovered that Cornelius was a terrible card player who cheated transparently and cheerfully, and accused her of cheating when she won, which she found delightfully inconsistent with his usual character. She read aloud to him one evening from the Harper's Weekly, the articles about the ongoing situation in the West, about the cattle trade, about the political news from Washington, and he listened and argued and held opinions that were sometimes different from hers, and made his case for them without either dismissing her views or simply agreeing because she was a woman. They talked about the future in those snowbound days, properly and with specificity, about what the ranch needed over the next 5 years, about whether Theodora wanted to continue keeping accounts or whether she might want something more, about the question of Harold Beckett and whether the letter had ever had legal standing that could be pursued. "A lawyer looked at something similar for a man I knew," Cornelius said one afternoon. "A promissory note that had been denied. He had a case, though it took time." "My father's letter is not a promissory note," Theodora said. "It's a moral claim more than a legal one, but I've thought about it." "What did you conclude?" "I concluded that I have what I need, that pursuing Harold Beckett through the courts would cost more in time and money and energy than it would return, and that I would rather put that time and energy into work that matters." She paused. "But I would like to write him a letter, not a legal one, a personal one, telling him exactly what his refusal meant and what it cost me and what it taught me about him." "Have you written it?" "In my head, several times." "Write it," Cornelius said. "Not to send if you don't want to send it, but write it. It'll be better out of your head and onto paper." She did write it, that afternoon at the kitchen table with the snow falling outside the window, and it was 3 pages long and precise and clear. and when she read it back, she felt that it was the truest thing she had written since the letter she had sent to her father's grave in her head on the day she had left Ohio. She did not send it. She folded it and put it with the original letter, the soft creased letter that no one had honored, and she put them both in the bottom of her trunk, and she felt lighter for it. On Christmas Day, with the snow bright on the ground and the kitchen filled with the smell of the turkey she had been roasting since early morning, Cornelius Malone gave Theodora Norris a small wrapped parcel before breakfast, while the hands were still in the bunkhouse, and the house was theirs alone, and inside it was a brooch of blue enamel that he had ordered from a jewelry catalog, and which she could see had taken some thought on his part to select. It was not extravagant. It was simply lovely, and it was exactly what she would have chosen for herself. She pinned it on immediately, and then she gave him the gift she had made for him, a leather-bound account ledger with his name stamped on the cover, which she had arranged to have done at the tanner's in Caldwell on her last supply run. And inside the front cover she had written, in her careful clear handwriting, a record of every improvement to the ranch's financial situation since she had arrived in July, which amounted to a considerable sum over 6 months of better feed contracts and recovered accounts and more efficient purchasing. He read through it slowly and then looked up at her and said, "This is the best gift anyone has ever given me." And she laughed and said, "You are the only man alive for whom an accounting ledger is the best gift anyone has ever given him." And he said, entirely seriously, "I am aware of that," and they both laughed, and the morning was bright and cold and clean and perfect. On the 2nd of January, 1879, with the new year barely begun and the winter settled firmly around the ranch, Cornelius asked Theodora to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He had never been a man for productions. They were in the kitchen after supper. She was washing the dishes and he was drying them, which was a thing he had started doing some weeks back without comment, simply picking up the cloth and standing beside her at the basin, and she had let it happen because she liked it, the easy domesticity of it, the closeness. He set down the plate he was drying and said, "Theodora, I want to marry you." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the direct, honest look she knew so well by then, the look that did not hedge or perform. "I want to marry you too," she said. He let out a breath that suggested he had not been entirely certain, which touched her more than any elaborate declaration would have done. "I was going to ask more formally," he said. "I had a plan." "Did the plan involve a great deal of kneeling and speeches?" "Not exactly, but some degree of formality." "I like this better," she said. "This is us." He reached out and took her hand, the way a man takes a hand when he means something by it, and held it for a moment with the soapy water still on both their fingers and the winter dark outside the kitchen window and the house warm and theirs around them. "This is us," he agreed. They were married in March of 1879 at the small Methodist church in Caldwell, with Reverend Alderson officiating and Martha Alderson crying happy tears, and the ranch hands Porter, Silas, and Red standing along one wall of the church looking both proud and very uncomfortable in their best clothes. Several families from the surrounding ranches attended, because by then Theodora had made something of herself in the community and people had noticed, and because Cornelius Malone was a man who was respected and whose decisions were, if not always fully understood, at least trusted. Theodora wore a dress she had made herself from a cream-colored wool she had ordered from a dry goods supplier in Wichita, because she was not going to spend the ranch's money on something impractical when she was perfectly capable of making something beautiful. And she wore the blue enamel brooch pinned at the collar, and she carried a small bunch of early spring wildflowers that Martha Alderson had pressed on her that morning from her own dooryard garden. She looked by any measure entirely herself, which was exactly what she wanted. Cornelius wore a good dark suit that he had made in Caldwell for the occasion, and he stood at the front of the church with a composed expression that Theodora could see from 6 feet away, contained a significant amount of something that was neither composure nor its close relative, and she loved him extravagantly for it. The ceremony was brief and direct and real, and when Reverend Alderson asked them to exchange vows, they looked at each other and said the words with the weight of people who meant them to the last syllable. And when Cornelius's hand closed around hers at the moment the Reverend pronounced them married, Theodora Norris, who was now Theodora Malone, felt the full circle close around the grief, and the journey and the silver dollar and the letter no one had honored, and felt that the circle was not a prison but a home. There was a celebration at the ranch that afternoon, the kind of impromptu gathering that frontier communities were good at, with food appearing from seemingly nowhere and several men producing instruments that they played with varying degrees of skill and some considerable enthusiasm, and Porter, who turned out to have an unexpectedly fine voice, sang 3 songs with what Theodora considered genuine feeling. Harold Beckett was not there. He had not been invited. His name did not come up. The spring of 1879 was the best spring Theodora could remember since her childhood, and she was aware that this was partly the season and partly the state she was in, the particular brightness that attaches to happiness when you have known its absence well enough to recognize the thing fully when it arrives. She and Cornelius worked the ranch together with the seamless efficiency of 2 people who had been figuring out each other's rhythms for months and had, by the spring, reached the kind of deep working understanding that takes most people years to achieve. She continued to keep the books, and the ranch's financial situation continued to improve, and Cornelius proved to be exactly as good at taking her recommendations as he had seemed to be, which was to say completely, without ego, because he was interested in the ranch doing well and not in being the person who was always right. They had their arguments. Marriage in a working environment made that inevitable, and they were both direct people with strong opinions, and there were evenings when the kitchen had a certain temperature to it that was not the stove. But they argued well, which is to say honestly and without cruelty, and with a genuine interest in reaching the other person's position rather than simply winning, and they always resolved back to the same fundamental agreement, which was that they were on the same side. In August of 1879, Theodora told Cornelius she was expecting a child. He received the news in the kitchen at breakfast, on a Tuesday morning in late summer, with the kitchen door open to the morning air and the smell of the last of the summer garden coming in on the breeze, and his response was not what she might have predicted, which was that he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then looked up at her and said, in a voice that was very quiet and entirely unguarded, "I am so glad." She sat down across from him, and they talked about it for an hour, the way they talked about things that mattered, thoroughly and with real attention, and Cornelius held her hand across the table and was as present and solid as the ranch house around them. Their son was born in April of 1880. With Martha Alderson and a capable ranch wife named Grace Hartley in attendance, and he came into the world in the early morning hours with the spring rain on the roof and the smell of Kansas earth and new grass coming through the window, and Cornelius was in the next room because that was the custom of the time, and he was there in the house, and he was not going anywhere. When Martha Alderson brought him into the next room and told him he had a son, he went very still for a moment in the way that some men go still when confronted with the largest things, and then he went into the bedroom and sat beside Theodora on the bed, and held the baby with the careful intensity of a man who understands that he is holding something important, and the way he looked at them both was so completely without defense or pretense that Theodora, who had already been through a significant amount emotionally in the last several hours, wept with pure gladness. They named him Jefferson Cornelius Malone for Theodora's father, and from the earliest weeks of his life it was apparent that he was going to be a person of some character, persistent and curious, and already, in some way that defied precise articulation, recognizably both his parents. The ranch grew. Cornelius extended the cattle operation through the early 1880s as the cattle trade in Kansas evolved, moving with the changes in the market with more flexibility than many of his neighbors, partly by instinct, and partly because Theodora was reading every newspaper and industry publication she could find, and had developed a genuinely sophisticated understanding of the economics of the cattle trade. She was not a person who sat at the edge of the work. She was in the middle of it, and the ranch's growing prosperity was as much a product of her mind as of his hands. In 1882, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose Malone, who arrived in the summer heat with less drama than her brother, but with an expression from the first hours of her life that suggested she was fully capable of providing her own drama when the occasion called for it, and who was, from the beginning, the kind of person about whom people said she was going to be something. Porter had married by then, a quiet, steady woman from Caldwell named Agnes, who came to the ranch and became, over the years, as much a part of its life as the cottonwood trees along the creek. Silas had left the previous year to try his luck with a homestead further west, and they had wished him well with genuine feeling. Red had stayed, and by 1882 he was more foreman than hand, a young man grown into real competence, which both Cornelius and Theodora had watched happen with the particular satisfaction of people who had played some small part in it. One afternoon in the fall of 1882, Theodora was in the small room off the kitchen that had become her office, going through the ranch's accounts for the quarter, when she heard the sound of a wagon on the road and looked up through the window. It was an ordinary enough sight on the road past the ranch, which had been well traveled since the town had grown, and she might have looked away except that something about the wagon made her look again. It was a plain wagon, nothing distinctive about it, but the man driving it was Harold Beckett. She knew him immediately, even at distance, by the particular set of his bulk on the seat and the color of the coat he wore. A brown canvas coat she remembered from the interior of his store on the day she had arrived in Caldwell with her trunk and her letter and her dollar. He was not stopping at the ranch. The wagon was moving past on the road, going in the direction of town, and he did not look toward the ranch house. He was simply a man passing on a road in the normal course of his life. Theodora watched him until the wagon disappeared over the rise, and then she sat for a moment with the account book open in her hands, and the afternoon light coming through the window of her office, which was in the house she had helped to build into something, with the sounds of her household around her, the baby Clara in the next room with Agnes, Jefferson playing somewhere outside with a persistence that usually involved at least one fall, Cornelius's voice from the direction of the barn talking to Red about something to do with the winter feed order. She thought about the letter. She thought about her father, about his careful handwriting and his faith in the basic decency of other men, and about the fact that the man who had refused to honor his faith had just passed on the road outside her window and had not even known she was there, while she was sitting in her own office in her own home, with the accounts of a thriving ranch in her hands and a life that was so much larger than anything Harold Beckett's assistants could have built. She thought about the letter she had written in December of 1878, the personal one she had never sent, the one folded with the original letter in the bottom of her trunk. She went to the trunk. She found the two letters, the one her father had written and the one she had written herself. She read them both. Then she went to the stove and lifted the lid and placed both letters on the fire, and she watched them go, the careful words of Jefferson Norris and her own reply to the injustice of it, both of them turning to ash in the good Kansas afternoon, and she felt nothing that was not peace. Cornelius found her in the kitchen a few minutes later, washing her hands at the basin, and he knew her well enough by then to look at her face and know that something had shifted. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. "Beckett passed on the road." He went very still in the way she knew. "It's fine," she said. "It was fine, I've let it go." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his face relaxed into quiet satisfaction. "Good," he said. "I burned the letters, both of them." How does that feel? She considered it honestly. Like finishing something, like closing a door on a room you've already moved out of. He came to stand beside her at the basin and put his arm around her shoulders, the easy, solid gesture of a man who had been doing this for 3 years and still meant it every time. Jefferson is demanding you come and explain to him why horses have to stay outside, he said. He is in disagreement with this policy, Theodora laughed. He is his father's son. He has your stubbornness. He has both of ours, which is frankly terrifying. They went out together into the afternoon to find their son, who was indeed at the corral fence making a serious case to no one in particular that Storm, who was aging gracefully in the corral, and was now a very dignified horse, should be allowed to come inside. And the October sky was enormous and bright over the Kansas plains, and the cottonwoods along the creek were burning gold, and Clara was awake now in Agnes's arms on the porch making the specific sound that meant she wanted her mother. And the ranch was alive with all its good noise. The years that followed were full years, years that had the density of a life genuinely lived. The cattle trade continued to change, and Cornelius and Theodora navigated those changes together, shifting the operation more toward horses in the mid-1880s when the cattle market contracted, because Theodora had been watching the numbers long enough to see it coming, and had argued for the adjustment before most of their neighbors had recognized the need, and they came through the economic pressures of the decade better than many ranches around them. In the spring of 1885, their third child was born, another son they named Daniel Porter Malone, in honor of Porter, who had been a fixture of their lives for 7 years by then, and who received the news of the honor with the stoic pleasure of a man who felt things deeply and expressed them sparingly. Daniel arrived during a thunderstorm, which Theodora would always maintain was appropriate, given his subsequent personality. Jefferson grew into a boy of considerable intelligence, and the kind of physical fearlessness that kept his parents informed about the capabilities of the ranch's medical supplies. By the age of 8, he was already competent on horseback in the way that children who grow up around horses develop a bone-deep relationship with them, and he had begun to show a real facility with numbers that delighted Theodora, and which Cornelius watched with the quiet pride of a man who recognizes that something has been given to his child that he wished had been given to him. Clara was everything the expression on her infant face had promised. She was fierce and funny and tender in turns, passionate about the horses in a way that was actually more sophisticated than her brother's fearlessness, her approach to them careful and observational where his was confident and instinctive. She was also, by the time she was 5, absolutely clear about the fact that she was going to do things her own way, and Theodora looked at her daughter sometimes with a recognition that was simultaneously amused and profound. One evening in the fall of 1885, when the 3 children were settled, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet in the late evening after a day that had been full of everything, Cornelius and Theodora sat on the porch together in the cooling air, the way they had been doing since the first summer, since those early evenings when everything between them was still finding its shape. The Kansas sky was enormous and full of stars, the way it was on clear fall nights. The Milky Way stretched overhead in its full impossible abundance, and the lights of the ranch buildings were warm in the dark, and the horses were quiet in the corral, and the cottonwoods along the creek made their familiar sound. "Do you remember," Theodora said, "that first day in Caldwell, the stagecoach? I remember it. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified, and I was trying very hard not to show it." "You weren't showing it," he said. "You were showing something else entirely." "What was I showing?" He thought about it. "That you were not going to be undone. Whatever happened, you were not going to come apart." She looked at the stars for a moment. "I very nearly came apart when Beckett dismissed me. I know I could see it, just barely. You saw through me from the beginning." "Not through you," he said. "I saw you clearly. That's different." She turned to look at him in the dark. He was looking out at the night with the comfortable gravity of a man who was exactly where he had chosen to be, and the lamplight from the sitting room window caught the side of his face, and he was, she thought, not for the first time, the most interesting face she had ever known. All those strong planes and honest lines that had been there from the beginning and had only deepened with the years. "I had $1," she said. $1 silver and a letter no one would honor. I know. And you honored it. Not because you owed my father anything, because you saw that it was right." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "I honored it because you deserved to have it honored," he said. "Your father wrote it because he believed in you. That was worth something, regardless of what Beckett thought." She reached over and took his hand in the dark, and he closed his fingers around hers with the same firm, brief rightness she had felt the first time he had done it, standing outside Beckett's store in the July sun with her trunk at her feet and her whole uncertain future spread out before her. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me." "Nevertheless," she said. It was what she had said to him that first day, and he remembered it. She could tell by the way something shifted in his face in the lamplight, the old familiar quiet smile. "Nevertheless," he agreed. They sat together on the porch for a long time after that, in the good silence of two people who had run out of anything necessary to say because everything necessary had long since been said, and was living now in the house behind them, and the ranch around them, and the life they had built together out of a $1 and a letter, and an afternoon in July when a man had walked out of a general store and picked up a woman's trunk because it was the right thing to do. In 1887, on the 10th anniversary of Jefferson Norris's death, Theodora sat down at the kitchen table in the house she had been mistress of for 8 years and wrote a long letter to Ohio, to the church where her father was buried, asking the minister there to have a proper stone marker placed on the grave, because the one that had been placed at the time of his death had been a modest wooden marker, and she had always meant to do something better. She enclosed money enough for the stone and for the inscription she wanted, which was not elaborate, just his name and his dates, and the words "a man who believed in the decency of others," which she felt was true and complete. She told Cornelius about it over supper, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "That's right," in the tone he used for things that were simply correct, and she knew he understood what it meant to her, and that understanding was its own form of tribute. Jefferson was 9 years old by then, and had begun, with the very serious air of a boy who has thought about something carefully, to ask questions about his grandfather and about Ohio, and about the journey his mother had made before he was born. Theodora answered his questions with the honesty she tried to bring to all things, telling him about Jefferson Norris and his merchant operation and the letters and the $1 and the stagecoach and the day she had arrived in Caldwell with everything she had in a single trunk. "And Papa was in the store," Jefferson said, with the expression of a child assembling a story he wants to understand fully. "Papa was in the store," Theodora confirmed. "And he helped you. He offered me work." Which was what I needed. Jefferson considered this with his father's particular gravity, because grandfather wrote the letter. The letter was what brought me to Caldwell. But your father was what made it worth coming. The boy looked at his father across the supper table, working this out. Cornelius looked back at his son with an expression that was as unguarded as anything Theodora had ever seen on him, the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected life to give him and knows it. "Your mother," Cornelius said to his son, with deliberate care, "walked 900 miles on hope alone and made something out of nothing. Remember that." "I remember it," Jefferson said, with the solemn certainty of a 9-year-old who means what he says. Clara, who was 5, said, "What's 900 miles?" And the table dissolved into laughter, and Daniel, who was 2, laughed along without knowing why, which made everyone laugh harder. The ranch in the late 1880s was a different place than it had been in the summer of 1878, and the difference was entirely in the direction of more life, more noise, more activity, more love filling the rooms and the corrals and the kitchen and the long evenings on the porch. Porter and Agnes had 2 children of their own by then, and the families had grown together in the way that happens on working ranches, where proximity and shared difficulty create bonds that last, so that the Malone children and the Porter children grew up together in a way that made the question of exactly whose family was whose somewhat academic. Red, whose actual name turned out to be James Calloway, and who had come to the ranch at 17, and was now a man of 26, had in the spring of 1887 brought back from a trip to Caldwell not just the monthly supplies, but also a young woman named Harriet who he introduced with the slightly desperate air of a man, presenting something he is very attached to people whose opinion he cares about. Harriet was practical and warm, and had a sense of humor that made her immediately at home in the kitchen with Theodora, and the fact that Red had found her was one of the small perfect things of that year. Cornelius Malone at 38 was the same man he had been at 31 when Theodora had arrived, only more himself, more settled into the bones of who he was, with the particular confidence of someone who has built a life that he is genuinely satisfied with. He still said little that was not practical, and still meant everything he said, and still pushed his hat back on his head when he was thinking. And the gray eyes were the same eyes they had always been, direct and honest, and when they looked at Theodora, still carrying that quality she had first seen by lamplight on a November evening in 1878, something open and undefended. Theodora at 34 was a woman who had found the exact shape of the life she wanted, which is not something everyone manages, and she was aware of it. She was aware of it in the way she moved through her days, with the ease of someone who knows where they are and why they are there. And she was aware of it in the way she looked at her children and her husband and her house, and the ranch spreading out around her under the tremendous Kansas sky. And she was aware of it in the particular way. She was aware of it on the evenings when she thought about Ohio and the stagecoach and the letter, which she thought about less frequently now than she once had, and when she did think about them it was with the calm affection of someone returning to the origin of a good story. In the spring of 1889, there was a change of a particular significance. The Indian Territory to the south and the unassigned lands in the center of present-day Oklahoma were being opened to white settlement in what the government was calling the Land Run, and the entire region was in a state of movement and expectation. Several of the ranching families around Caldwell considered whether to participate, to go south into the new territory and stake land claims, and it was a topic of considerable conversation in the town and in the ranch houses and at the church suppers. Cornelius and Theodora talked about it at length, the way they talked about everything significant, from all angles and with real information. The opportunity was real. There was good land in the territory, and people who went in the first days of the run could claim substantial acreage. But the ranch in Kansas was already established and productive, and Theodora had understood something about the economics of the cattle and horse operations that suggested the immediate future was better served by consolidating and improving what they had than by taking the risk of starting over in new country. "We know this land," she said, one evening when they had been discussing it for some time. "We know its winters and its summers and what it will bear. I would rather deepen what we have here than begin again with what we don't know." "I agree," he said, and she could see that he had already been thinking in the same direction but had wanted to hear her reason through it. This was something she had come to understand about him, that he trusted her thinking and used the discussions not to convince her but to test his own conclusions. They stayed in Kansas. Several of their neighbors went south into the territory, and some of them did well and some of them did not, and the world moved on in its complicated way, and the Malone ranch deepened as Theodora had said it would, the operations growing more sophisticated and the land more fully understood over the years. By 1890, Jefferson was 11 and becoming seriously interested in the horse operations, which had become the core of the ranch's work, breeding and training working horses for the ranches and farms of the region. He spent hours with Cornelius in the corral, learning the language of horses the way children learn languages when they are young, instinctively and permanently. Clara was 8 and had begun demanding the education that Theodora was determined she was going to have, already reading everything available and asking questions that her mother answered fully, and her father answered with the particular satisfaction of a man whose daughter is evidently going to be formidable. Daniel was 5 and showed early signs of being interested in building things, a quality that no one in the immediate family could entirely account for, but which everyone agreed was going to be either very useful or very inconvenient, possibly both. That spring, Theodora wrote to her father's minister in Ohio and received a letter back telling her that the stone had been placed and that it was handsome and exactly as she had specified. And enclosed with the letter was a small sketch the minister had made of it, Jefferson Norris's name in clean letters and his dates and the words beneath them. She pinned the sketch to the wall of her office and looked at it sometimes when she was working, and she felt that she had done right by him, that she had taken the last gift he had given her, the letters and the faith in people that they represented, and made something that would have made him glad. On a Saturday morning in October of 1890, Theodora drove herself into Caldwell for the quarterly supply run, which she still did herself most of the time, because she found it a useful occasion to maintain the business relationships she had built in the town over 12 years. The town had grown considerably since 1878, and the cattle trade had shifted and changed with the expanding rail network, and the Caldwell she drove into in 1890 was a more settled and less raw place than the town where she had stepped off the stagecoach with her trunk and her dollar and her folded letter. She did her business, spoke to the feed supplier and the dry goods merchant, and stopped at the post office for the ranch's mail, and had a brief pleasant conversation with Martha Alderson, whose husband the Reverend had finally agreed to let her organize a proper lending library in the church social hall, a project she had been advocating for years, and which was exactly the kind of thing Caldwell needed. She was loading the wagon when she saw Harold Beckett across the street. He was older, considerably older than the last time she had seen him on the road outside the ranch, and he was moving more slowly, and someone she vaguely recognized as a younger man was with him, probably the Missouri nephew he had mentioned all those years ago. Harold Beckett looked, she thought, like a man who had not had a difficult life but who had also not had an interesting one, and he moved through the street of the town he had been prosperous in for all those years with the contentment of a man who had never needed to reckon with what he had refused. He did not recognize her. She could see from across the street that she was simply a woman loading a wagon, nothing particular, and his gaze moved over her and passed without any acknowledgement. Theodora finished loading the wagon and climbed up onto the seat and gathered the reins and turned the horse toward home. She drove the 12 miles back to the ranch in the good October afternoon, through the familiar landscape that had become the most known place in the world to her, every rise and dip of the road familiar, every landmark something she had named in her own mind over 12 years of traveling this route. She thought about Harold Beckett, and she thought about the letter and the silver dollar and the stagecoach and everything that had come after, and she felt nothing that was not gratitude, not the complicated gratitude of someone who is grateful to a person who helped them, but the deep, simple gratitude of someone who has discovered that the world contains more possibility than its difficulties suggest. That a silver dollar and a letter no one will honor can be the beginning of something rather than the end of it, if you are willing to keep walking. She came over the last rise in the road, and the ranch spread out below her in the afternoon light, the white house and the barn and the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold with October, and she could see Jefferson and Cornelius in the corral working with one of the young horses, both of them there, the two of them moving with the easy competence of people who know what they are doing and take pleasure in it. And Clara was on the porch reading with the absolute focus of a child who has gone somewhere else entirely. And the smoke from the kitchen chimney was going straight up in the still air. She drove the wagon down into the yard, and Jefferson came running to help unload, because that was what he did. He was that kind of boy, and Cornelius came to the fence of the corral and watched her come in with the quiet smile that had not changed in 12 years. "Good run?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "Martha Alderson is finally getting her library. About time. I had the same thought." She climbed down from the wagon, and he was there to take the reins. The natural exchange of two people who had been managing a life together for long enough that the movements were as easy as breathing. And she stood in the yard of the ranch with the October sun warm on her face, and the world arranged around her in a pattern that was entirely her own, built from grief and determination, and a journey, and a man who had believed that a letter written by a dead man to a woman alone in the world was worth honoring. The evening settled over the ranch the way it always did, gradually and with great certainty, the light going from gold to rose to the deep blue of a clear fall night, and the family gathered at the supper table, Jefferson talking about the horse they had been working with, and the specific way it had begun to respond that afternoon, Clara looking up from the book she was still technically trying to read while also eating. Daniel explaining with great seriousness a structure he was building in the yard from wood scraps, and Cornelius listening to all of them with the patient pleasure of a man who is very glad to be where he is. Theodora looked down the table at her family, at this thing that had grown from a stagecoach stop and a silver dollar, and an act of simple human decency, and she thought that if she had only known, standing on that boardwalk in July of 1878, with the dust rising and the letter in her pocket and the future absolutely uncertain, that this was what the future contained, she would have wept with relief right there in the street, dignity and composure entirely aside. But perhaps it was better not to have known. Perhaps the journey was what made the arrival mean what it meant, and the silver dollar and the letter and Harold Beckett's refusal, and the man who had walked out of the store and picked up her trunk, were all necessary parts of the same story, all of them required to make this evening at this table on this ranch under this enormous sky possible. She reached for the bread and passed it to Jefferson, and said something to Daniel about his wooden structures, and looked across the table at Cornelius, who was looking at her with the gray eyes that had first looked at her properly on a boardwalk in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, and was looking at her now across 12 years and 3 children, and a life that had been made together out of work and honesty and love. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, the way he sometimes did, the gesture that said everything it had always said, and she pressed her fingers against his for a moment and then let go, because supper was on the table and the children were talking, and the evening was full and good and theirs. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek made their familiar sound in the October dark, and the horses were settled in the corral, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plains, and the ranch was lit and warm in the middle of all that dark and all that sky, a small, bright, particular thing, built by 2 people from almost nothing, and holding, in its rooms and its light and its life, everything that mattered.